Before you watch another video, I want you to stop for a moment and really pay attention because what you're about to hear is something very few people ever discuss. Think about it carefully. Many people believe that once they stop chasing an avoidant person, stop explaining themselves, and stop trying to save the relationship, absolutely nothing will change. They assume their silence won't matter because it often felt like their presence never mattered in the first place. But the reality is very different. Stay with me because this may completely change the way you understand what happened. The moment an avoidant realizes you've genuinely let go, not to make them jealous, not as a strategy, and not to get a reaction, but because you've honestly decided to move forward, something begins to shift deep inside them. A part of themselves they've kept hidden for a very long time starts waking up. This matters because you've probably spent months, maybe even years, wondering why every act of love seemed to push them farther away. The more patient you became, the more understanding you showed, and the more of yourself you gave, the more distant they seemed. Yet the moment you stop pouring your energy into the relationship, they begin to respond. Sometimes the changes are subtle, sometimes they're obvious. Either way, they notice. They feel the space you've left behind in a way your constant presence never allowed them to. Most people never understand why this happens. An avoidant person often builds their emotional world around the quiet belief that you'll always be there. Without realizing it, they expect you to wait, forgive, and reconnect whenever they finally feel ready. Over time, you become the emotional safety net beneath them. When that safety net disappears, not because you're playing games, but because you've truly stepped away, their inner world begins to shake. Many people mistake avoidance for a lack of caring. They assume avoidant people are emotionally cold, or that losing someone simply brings them relief. But that is only the story seen from the outside. Beneath that emotional distance is something much more complicated. Their greatest fear isn't love itself. Their greatest fear is losing control. It's feeling emotionally exposed. It's allowing themselves to become vulnerable. Hidden beneath all of those fears is an even deeper fear they rarely admit, even to themselves, the fear of being abandoned. Ironically, they often push people away to protect themselves from experiencing the very rejection they fear the most, while still longing for genuine closeness. That is why your absence affects them more deeply than you might imagine. At first, the changes are usually small. They may begin checking your social media more often. Their replies become slower, more thoughtful, or strangely cautious. They may send casual messages that seem insignificant, quietly testing whether you're still emotionally available. These behaviors are not random. They are signs that something inside them has recognized an important change. The certainty they once depended on is gone. The comfort of believing you'd always be there has disappeared. What happens next isn't always logical. They don't suddenly rush back with an apology or openly confess everything they've been feeling. Instead, their mind becomes crowded with unanswered questions. They replay conversations. They rethink past decisions. They analyze every interaction and wonder if they misunderstood your intentions. One part of them wants to reconnect. Another part remains terrified of emotional exposure. That inner conflict creates confusion, anxiety, and emotional pressure all at once. For the first time, they begin realizing the person they believed would always remain within reach may actually be gone. That realization often carries far more emotional weight than all the effort you invested trying to keep the relationship alive. Keep watching because the next part explains why letting go often creates the response chasing never could. If you've ever felt invisible in the life of an avoidant person, if you've questioned why your love, patience, and commitment never seem to make a difference, this is where everything starts making sense. You'll begin understanding why chasing often creates more distance, why genuine absence creates movement, and what is really happening inside an avoidant person's mind when they realize you've stopped fighting for the relationship. Many people wonder why avoidant individuals pull away when they're shown love, but seem to move closer once that love stops chasing them. Why does letting go create the reaction you wanted all along? The answer begins with the first stage of their internal response. When an avoidant realizes you've truly stopped fighting for the connection, their first reaction is often quiet panic. They rarely admit it. They almost never announce it. Most of the time, they won't even let it show on their face. They don't suddenly call you, confess their feelings, or explain everything they're experiencing. From the outside, it may seem as though nothing has changed. Inside, however, their nervous system is under tremendous pressure. Many people assume avoidant individuals move on easily and that your absence finally gives them peace. That's often the story they tell themselves, but it isn't the complete truth. Beneath the calm appearance is an emotional struggle they rarely allow anyone to see. Their emotional distance is often built on one quiet assumption that you'll always be there. Their way of coping depends on believing they can reconnect whenever they finally feel ready. Without noticing it, they come to rely on your consistency. You become a source of emotional stability they barely recognize until it's no longer available. The moment they realize your distance is genuine, not a tactic, not an attempt to get a reaction, but a real decision to move forward, the emotional foundation they've quietly depended on begins to crack. Contrary to what many people believe, intimacy itself isn't their greatest fear. What truly frightens them is losing emotional control, revealing their deepest feelings, and becoming vulnerable. Beneath those fears is an even deeper fear they rarely acknowledge, the fear of being abandoned. They often push people away before anyone has the chance to leave them, even while secretly hoping for real connection. When someone who once made them feel emotionally safe is suddenly gone, they don't remain untouched by it. Something shifts inside them. You may notice them quietly checking your social media more often. Their messages become shorter, slower, or unusually careful. They may hesitate before replying or communicate differently than before. One quiet question begins growing inside their mind. What if this person is really gone? That single thought changes everything. Avoidant people often feel secure as long as they believe you're still emotionally invested. As long as you're chasing, forgiving, and remaining available, they believe they can control the distance between you. But once you truly step away, that feeling of certainty disappears. Suddenly, they lose the person who provided emotional stability without asking for much in return. And that loss often affects them more deeply than they expected. Their response is rarely straightforward. They don't immediately apologize or openly express everything they feel. Instead, they retreat further into their own thoughts. They replay conversations, examine every interaction, and search for the exact moment everything changed. They wonder if they misunderstood something or whether they made a mistake, yet they don't know how to repair the relationship without exposing emotions they've spent years hiding. That creates an exhausting internal struggle. One part of them still wants complete independence. Another quietly longs for connection. Your absence forces those two sides to confront each other. For years, they may have convinced themselves they were happiest alone, that they didn't need anyone, and that emotional distance kept them safe. But when someone meaningful truly leaves, the emotional impact often surprises them. Even if they never admit it aloud, curiosity begins to grow. They may ask mutual friends about you, casually bring up old memories, or quietly watch your life from a distance, trying to understand where they still stand without revealing how much they care. Many people mistake this lack of direct pursuit for complete indifference. In reality, reaching out feels emotionally dangerous to them, and that fear, more than anything else, is often what keeps them silent. Yet your absence creates a storm they can no longer escape. Suddenly, you begin occupying their thoughts, far more than you ever did when you were constantly present, because now the possibility of losing you forever feels real. The experience affects both their emotions and their body. People with avoidant patterns often regulate themselves through emotional distance. When that distance no longer feels like their choice, the coping strategy they've depended on begins to fail. Anxiety starts rising. Feelings they buried for years slowly come to the surface. The attachment they spent so much energy denying becomes impossible to ignore. At first, they may withdraw even more, not because they don't care, but because they feel emotionally overwhelmed. Later, they often return in subtle ways. A casual message, a reaction to one of your posts, a small attempt to reopen communication without openly admitting what they're truly feeling. These actions aren't random. They are careful attempts to reconnect while still protecting themselves from vulnerability. For the first time, they begin experiencing the uncertainty, fear of loss, and longing that you've probably carried all along. That emotional shock slowly starts cracking the protective walls they've relied on for years. Memories become stronger, thoughts of you appear more often. Little by little, the desire to stay connected begins competing with their powerful instinct to protect themselves. The change rarely starts with dramatic apologies or emotional confessions. It usually begins with confusion. They spent so long believing you would always remain within reach that your absence feels unfamiliar. You represented stability, patience, and consistency. Even while creating distance, they depended on those qualities far more than they ever realized. Once they're gone, everything feels less secure. Silence becomes uncomfortable. Distance feels much larger than they expected. The sense of control they quietly depended on begins slipping away, leaving them restless, unsettled, and emotionally unbalanced. Stay with me, because what happens next explains why genuine absence often speaks louder than years of chasing ever could. That confusion comes from losing predictability. Predictability gave them comfort. Your steady presence created an emotional system they quietly relied on without fully recognizing it. Once that system disappears, uncertainty takes its place. Their need for control collides with emotions they've spent years avoiding, forcing them to experience attachment, fear, and longing all at once. That is why everything begins changing the moment you genuinely let go. Panic, confusion, endless overthinking, quiet attempts to reconnect, emotional instability, a growing awareness of how much they depended on your presence. All of it begins unfolding beneath the surface. They rarely reveal it, but this is often the first real glimpse into the emotional world they've worked so hard to hide. As the confusion grows, it slowly turns into uneasiness. They begin noticing things they once ignored. They check your online activity more often. They pause on your stories. They notice small changes in your life. They quietly search for reassurance without fully understanding why. Deep inside, they're trying to discover whether the emotional door is still open. When they realize you're no longer reaching out or waiting for them, the uncertainty grows even stronger. They struggle to understand why your distance feels different this time, more permanent, more final. People with avoidant patterns often struggle with uncertainty because uncertainty forces them to feel emotions they usually keep buried. Their attachment system is built around avoiding emotional overwhelm. They create distance when emotions become intense. They detach when relationships grow deeper. They retreat whenever vulnerability feels too close. But now, the overwhelming emotion comes from your absence, and that is a situation they were never prepared to handle. Instead of sitting with those feelings, they try to think their way through them. They replay conversations. They revisit memories. They search for the exact moment everything changed. Eventually, one difficult question quietly appears, the question they've avoided for a long time. Did I push this person too far? Keep watching, because this next realization explains why self-doubt becomes one of the hardest emotions for them to face. That single question slowly transforms confusion into self-doubt. They begin questioning their assumptions, their choices, and the decisions that created the distance between you. Self-doubt feels deeply uncomfortable because it opens the door to vulnerability and forces them to consider something they've spent years denying, that they may have cared far more than they ever allowed themselves to admit. Rather than immediately reaching out, they continue observing from a distance. They gather small clues, trying to understand how you feel without asking you directly. They pay attention to your tone, your online activity, the things you share, and any sign that you might still be emotionally available. Although people with avoidant patterns often pull away from intimacy, they still long for connection. The difficulty is that emotional closeness overwhelms them, so they never truly learn how to hold on to it. When they realize you're no longer emotionally within reach, the emotional world they quietly depended on begins falling apart. For so long, they believed they could create distance whenever they wanted, because you would always remain there. Once that belief disappears, a heavy emotional pressure settles in. Confusion becomes tension, tension becomes restlessness, and eventually that restlessness grows into a quiet fear. They can no longer ignore the unsettling possibility that they may actually lose you. People with avoidant patterns aren't simply afraid of commitment. More often, they're afraid of losing themselves inside emotional vulnerability. Yet losing someone who made them feel emotionally safe creates a completely different fear. It doesn't threaten their independence, it threatens the emotional balance they've spent years protecting. The hidden fear of abandonment they worked so hard to avoid slowly rises to the surface. When they recognize you're genuinely moving forward, the defenses that once protected them begin exposing everything they tried to suppress. They may continue acting as though everything is fine, but inside, the confusion becomes something much heavier. It slowly turns into grief, even if they never call it that. You become the unfinished chapter they can't stop thinking about. The unanswered question that refuses to disappear. The silence that echoes louder than your presence ever did. Most won't rush back with dramatic apologies or emotional declarations. Instead, they quietly reach a point where the emotional walls they've relied upon begin to crack. For the first time, they realize something has fundamentally changed because you stopped carrying the relationship. One of the biggest misunderstandings about avoidant behavior is believing they panic simply because they're afraid of losing you. In reality, what shocks them first is losing the illusion that they controlled the emotional distance between you. As long as you kept reaching out, explaining yourself, solving problems, and carrying the connection forward, they felt safe remaining emotionally guarded. Your effort quietly filled the emotional gaps they couldn't fill themselves. The moment you step away with calm acceptance instead of anger, pressure, or manipulation, they enter emotional territory they don't know how to navigate. They finally begin recognizing that your patience, consistency, and genuine care were holding far more of the relationship together than they ever admitted. Without your effort, they lose more than the relationship itself. They also lose the emotional stability they had quietly come to depend on. At first, all they feel is confusion. They sense your energy has changed, yet nothing dramatic happened. You're no longer arguing, blaming, or demanding answers. You're simply no longer carrying the weight of the relationship alone. People with avoidant patterns often notice emotional energy long before they understand words. They feel the absence of your reassurance, your warmth, and the quiet emotional stability you consistently offered. That silence leaves them face to face with something they spent years trying to avoid: honest self-reflection. Questions begin rising that they've spent a long time trying to avoid. Why did they stop reaching out? Did I mistake their patience for permanence? Did I push them too far? Have I lost someone who truly cared about me? For someone with avoidant patterns, conflict is often easier to handle than emotional neutrality. Arguments still mean the connection exists. Calm detachment feels much more threatening because it suggests you've accepted the ending and started moving forward. That kind of silence gives them nothing to react against. Then another shift begins. For the first time, they start experiencing the real consequences of creating so much emotional distance. They assumed the relationship would always be waiting for them. They believed your love would remain available no matter how often they pulled away. Once you stop initiating conversations, stop giving endlessly, and stop carrying the connection by yourself, that belief slowly falls apart. The loss becomes impossible to ignore. Your absence forces them to recognize something they couldn't fully see before. They begin realizing your commitment wasn't desperation, it was generosity. Your communication wasn't pressure, it was honesty. Your presence wasn't overwhelming, it was comforting. What once seemed ordinary now becomes deeply valuable because it's no longer there. As they reflect, memories become clearer. They remember your patience, your understanding, your consistency. Those qualities become impossible to overlook. Life without your emotional presence creates a contrast they can't escape. Only after losing it do they begin understanding what it truly meant. Stay with me, because this next realization explains why genuine absence often teaches lessons that constant effort never could. Little by little, they begin recognizing they weren't protecting themselves from you. They were protecting themselves from intimacy, vulnerability, and emotions they never learned how to face. That realization creates an emptiness they never expected. Not peaceful solitude, but the quiet feeling that something meaningful is missing. Regret slowly replaces certainty. They begin experiencing the consequences of the emotional walls they spent years building. What surprises them most isn't conflict or rejection. It's your peace. They expected more arguments, more chasing, more emotional reactions. They never imagined you would quietly choose yourself instead. People with avoidant patterns rarely fear loss until it becomes real. They rarely fear silence until it lasts. They rarely fear someone leaving until that person has truly let go. That reality forces them to face a difficult truth they've avoided for a very long time. Maybe you weren't asking for too much after all. Maybe they simply weren't emotionally ready to give the relationship what it needed. Their first response isn't relief. It isn't indifference. It's shock. And for many people with avoidant tendencies, shock becomes the first step toward awareness. This is often where what many people describe as the phantom X effect begins to appear. Once someone is genuinely gone, the avoidant starts viewing the relationship through a completely different perspective. They remember your patience more clearly. They recognize your kindness. Messages they once dismissed now feel like sincere expressions of love. The care they once interpreted as pressure suddenly looks like emotional safety. People with avoidant patterns often understand relationships through contrast instead of conversation. It isn't until your emotional presence disappears that they fully realize what it meant. Your absence becomes a mirror, reflecting everything they couldn't recognize while you were still there. In that reflection, they quietly acknowledge something they've avoided all along. They cared. They formed a real attachment, and losing you hurts far more than they expected. What they miss isn't only your presence. They also miss the version of themselves that existed around you, the person who felt lighter, more open, more relaxed, more playful, and more emotionally alive. That awareness doesn't appear overnight. It grows quietly, becoming stronger over time, until it can no longer be ignored. The emotional safety you offered is something many avoidant people don't fully realize they depend on until it's gone. Losing that safe space forces them to face emotions they've buried for years and experience a kind of regret that changes the way they see both themselves and relationships. The version of themselves that felt accepted, calm, and free to lower their guard existed because of the connection you created together. When you leave, that feeling leaves with you. As this truth settles in, an internal struggle begins. They don't want to chase. They don't want to admit they care. They don't want to expose their vulnerability. Yet the emotional pressure keeps growing. They begin wondering whether you've moved on, whether you still care, or whether reaching out would only end in rejection. For someone who depends on control to feel emotionally safe, this uncertainty becomes deeply unsettling. Instead of making dramatic declarations, they usually return in quiet, low-risk ways: a casual message, a reaction to an old post, a shared song. Small gestures become careful attempts to reconnect without risking complete emotional exposure. These actions aren't random. They're cautious efforts to reopen a door while still protecting themselves. Ironically, losing you doesn't create the relief they expected. Once the silence settles, many begin realizing they cared far more than they ever admitted. They recognize your patience, your consistency, and your emotional support as qualities that made them feel safer than they understood at the time. They slowly realize what they pushed away wasn't pressure, it was genuine care.